Well, hello.
Hello.
Hello. My prayer is that this message will nourish your inner garden. So I have a question to start with, which is, who here has kept a garden before? Any sort? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Who kept a garden?
You kept a garden? No. So you and Alan, okay. And my question then is, why do you keep a garden? Why does anyone garden? What does it do for you?
Beauty. I experience the joy of growth.
Ooh, okay.
Just wonderful.
Raises my spirit. I love it. I feel connected to the earth.
I just did it for practical reasons.
What'd you say? Joe, what'd you say?
Practical reasons like food. Yeah.
Why do you landscape?
Beauty.
What was that?
Beauty.
Why do you landscape?
Well, I'm particularly mindful as we begin this message today, which is really we're creating something right now. But I am particularly mindful of the farmers and the gardeners who are affected by the scorching heat out west, who are losing their precious crops. And we've just learned that in mid-Michigan, we've had quite a bit of flooding, and how that affects not only crops, but also our homes and our vehicles and how we get along. So as we share this message this morning, we're mindful that not always is the garden able to thrive. And sometimes disorder and catastrophe happen. And that's an important part of the whole cycle of life and death and regrowth. But I'd like to bring our minds at first to Scripture, which feeds the inner garden in a very unique way inside of each of us. Each of us grows something new from God when we hear the Word. Why? Because it's living. It has spiritual substance in it. So we're being watered. When Theron was reading, we're being watered. And the very first act of creation comes in 2 different versions of the creation story. The creation story, we have one version that is giving us an all-powerful God who by speech says, "Let there be light," and days pass, and the 6th day human beings are created, same day as animals, and it was good. The second version of creation, however, God is more hands-on with us. What happens is that God breathes, takes man from human beings from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils. And there was life. And human beings were created before a garden. So human beings were created by this God that interacted with us, and then provided a garden for us to till. What is till? Work that ground. To work it. And to live it. And so God gave us this garden, what we know to be Garden of Eden. And in that garden, we thrived. And we knew we were interconnected and interdependent with it, and we still are. And then we bring ourselves today as we reflect on the gift of earth and being connected and interdependent with the earth. We take it a deeper level now, and we realize that there is a garden inside of each one of us. But it's kind of a mysterious place, isn't it? Because it's not something we actually can, in a grounded way, physically touch. In a tactile way, we can't watch it grow. It's kind of interesting. It's this place inside of us that grows, where silent things live. And we don't know, really, most of what's happening. And so I went searching on the internet, which I love to do, and I landed in a place I've been before, which is under the tutelage of an old professor. She's not old, but previous professor. And her name is Reverend Dr. Wilma Wake. And she wrote on her website called swedenborgencommunity.org, if you ever want to have a virtual worship experience. It's very rich. She includes the arts and all kinds of interesting, she's a perpetual learner, and she has great stuff on there. But on swedenborgencommunity.org, I found Reverend Dr. Wake's message on God and gardening. And she says that when she feels the need to water the inner garden, she goes to the great mystics of all time. And the one that she landed on for this message that spoke to me was Teresa of Avila. Do you know when she was born? She actually died 100 years before Swedenborg was born.
Really?
Yeah, she was born in 1515. Yeah. And she was a Carmelite nun, and she was a teacher to John of the Cross. So she had a lot of wisdom that she shared with the world, and she wrote a lot of very important things as a mystic. But one of the things that spoke to me was that in this inner garden that lives in us and grows in us, and it's happening, and we don't really see or feel it most of the time. But she said the way to water your garden on the inside, any guesses? How does one water their inner garden?
Meditation,
Yep, prayer.
Prayer,
Prayer.
inspiration.
reading the word.
Yes. So Teresa of Avila said that prayer is the way to water. And in this busy life too, we just less and less, we stop. She says prayer is where the soul is fed, and the soul is that inner part of the being. Swedenborg would later discover that, but he didn't right away. He was looking for a seat of the soul. He was looking for a place in the body, like the pineal gland. He was looking for an actual location of the soul. He would later arrive at the realization that Teresa of Avila realized before, which was it's that inner place. And that prayer, however you find meaningful, prayer is the act of getting to that deeper self and knowing your deeper self. Because you know your surface self every day. You know how you function, you know your default position. You know what you go to when stressed. You know what you go to when you're joyful. But she's saying that prayer is the way to access that deeper part of yourself, to know that deeper part of yourself that is so intertwined with the divine. And there's nothing like it. If you seek peace, if you seek connection to the deepest part of yourself, Teresa of Avila would say, take that time for prayer. And she also gives us 2 types of prayer, which I found meaningful, so I'm going to share it with you. The first kind is meditation. And that's what we did at Timeless Wisdom this week. We went into a Reiki meditation for 45 minutes. And meditation for Teresa of Avila is a very intentional and structured approach to getting to that deeper self. It's the early stages of creating a garden, if you want to make a parallel. What do you do when you first garden? You have to till that soil. That's the hard work. You have to make sure it's ready for your plants or your seeds. And you have to water it. And you have to put marigolds around so the bugs don't eat it. You know, all these different little things that you do that are effort and structure. And then you have that part of the garden then that grows later silently itself, which is part of the joy. But let's go back to what she says. Meditation is one form. She says it's the form that is the early stages of our prayer life. It also includes reading other people's ideas. It includes reading and using your brain to think. It includes going to church like we do. It includes listening to other people pray like we do. But Teresa of Avila would also say that at some point, I don't know if you felt this, and I think you have, I know I have, at some point that more intentional thinking, structured prayer eventually becomes a little empty. Empty. Thank you. So this structured prayer that's more thinking and listening to others or reading about others, that structured prayer eventually, as you deepen in your soul journey, you eventually say, this isn't quite enough. So she says meditation is how we start out our garden. But then she says there's something called contemplative prayer, which is, she would say, a grace. And the only action that's required in this, any guesses?
Silence.
Receiving.
Openness and willingness.
So receiving in the silence, yes. And so she says this is a grace. We don't come to it easily. She said it's frustrating. We're frustrated and we're confused at first because our brains want to work it. But it's really an act of receiving, letting God guide, not thinking about words. It's what Reverend Bollinger was leading us in a few years ago, and it just wasn't where the group was at, but I can see where she was at. And so Teresa of Avila was saying that this is prayer of quiet, of silence. And this is where things grow in us at exponential rates. Teresa Avila would say that more is given in contemplative prayer than meditative prayer, and that what is given lasts longer. So let's do more of it, huh? That is an invitation and a reminder. You're here today. You're hearing this message. Does it nourish you? Is there time, more time, that you can give yourself with God to let that happen in the silent? My mom brought from Pennsylvania, she brought a stone that's in our garden. How lovely is the silence of growing things. And that's after all the work is done. But the work is necessary. So that's an important part. So we see that God creates in gardens. God walks in gardens. That's what we're going to sing a little bit later. I come to the garden alone. We'll be singing that. But God walks in gardens with us. And we see that in the stories, in the Garden of Eden. We see that in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is on his knees and he knows he must die to bring new life. He knows this is his time to die. He's in a garden realizing that. We see Mary of Magdalene, as Theron was reading from Scripture this morning, and how she actually saw the Lord as a gardener. And as I was walking this morning, and there was something that Linda said. There was something, bunny rabbits. I was watching bunny rabbits this morning, walking my dog. And as I realized that it was Jesus tilling the ground of humanity at that point. He just had risen. And he was viewed as a gardener. And I believe he was gardening humanity at that moment. That's what his energy and spirit was doing, and that's why Mary of Magdalene saw him as a gardener. It's quite an amazing thing, isn't it? The prophets, Jeremiah particularly, my favorite prophet, but also Amos, as Theron was reading this morning, they remind us that when we're in exile, Swedenborg's Latin word for that is vastation. That's the place where the ground is absolutely fallow, nothing grows. We're imprisoned. If we're talking metaphorically, we're imprisoned in some sort of frozen place in us, a place that's very flat and isn't growing. And Swedenborg would say that the prophets were seeing the exile, and God was speaking to them and saying, there will come a time where you will go home. It won't be right now, dang it. But you will go home, and gardens will grow again, and the crops will grow, and grapes and wine will flow. That's what we heard. There will come a time where more life will be yours again. And how important that is. So we encounter, if we can leave this space and this worship and reflection, if we can encounter how important it is to remember that God is with us in this garden. God is a garden. And we're working that with God. That we see God in the toiling and in the growing and in the harvest. Most of the time we notice God in the harvest. But we experience our very beginnings when we garden. Because when we get our fingers in the dirt and we feel the sun making us sweat and we plant those plants and we watch them grow, we experience our beginnings. And we experience the growth and the death and the perennial new life. That's the miracle. Most of what grows we do not see by the grace of God.